Welcome to a new episode of the Crowd Assist podcast presented by Trainwreck Sports. When I'm stumbling right out of the gate, you know we're in for a good show, everybody. As always, we are sponsored by Picasso's Pizza, and I told you all this last week. I moved to Long Island about a year ago, a little more so, and I don't care what my girlfriend says. I don't care what her family says. They live here. I don't care what John Voight told me when I was in a Brooklyn pizza joint last November and I ran into him. Buffalo Pizza's where it's at. I don't care what anyone says, okay? And when I think of Buffalo Pizza, I think of Picasso's. They're open for takeout and delivery, and I've said this before, they actually deliver nationwide. So I have no excuse to get the flimsy, this crust pizza that I scarfed down right before the show. So, make them a part of your game day traditions now and support local businesses, because this is the time to do so more than ever. This episode of The Cap, just like last week, joined by Kevin Massari. Kevin, how's it going today, man?
Living the dream, man. How are you today?
Same here, man. A little stuffy in the basement, but, if that's all I got to complain about, it's a good day.
Yeah, that's right.
And for an exclusive look into what's been going on at Bill's training camp, I'm very happy to welcome great friend of Trainwreck, great friend of the show, and future recurring guest, Matt Parrino. He's the Bills beat reporter for New York Upstate. Matt, I know you've had a busy morning, definitely a lot of unexpected happening today, so I appreciate you taking the time.
Anytime, man. I'm glad to join the new look Crowd Assist podcast. Very excited to be joining the two of you gentlemen. I love the new look. I love the new show. I'm obviously a big Trainwreck Sports mark out here in these streets, so it's good to join the show and talk about Bills.
Oh yeah, man. Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you. I know we've been looking forward to it for a couple weeks now, so we'll just dive right in. Obviously, elephant in the room today. A lot of false positives happening, coming from the coronavirus testing at One Bills Drive, and it also happened around the league. So there's definitely some stuff to be sorted out there. But from a Bills perspective, obviously we know Josh Allen wasn't at practice today. Who else notable was missing, and what's kind of their path back to practicing with the team soon?
Well, it's good news for Bills fans is Adam Schefter reported, I think about an hour ago, that Josh Allen was per his sources, was one of the guys that popped, and they expect him to be back at practice tomorrow. And Brandon Beane said, everybody that did have a false positive today tested when they got to the facility, and they all were negative. So if they then tested negative again, have a second test, that's when they're freed up to return to practice. So I think the best thing to come out of this thing is that it's happening in middle of August here as opposed to early September or later, when this could impact a game week and a game day. I mean, if you find this out on a Friday, can a guy get back in time for a game on a Sunday morning, or however they end up, sparsing out the schedule if college football is not being played, etc. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see how they handle it. I think this gives them a more specific example of how to prepare for it now and put better protocols in place. Brandon Beane said they were talking to Dr. David Sills, or Alan Sills, his son, David Sills, who's playing the Bills. They were talking to him this morning about just the whole process and how everybody's learning about this. And it's just, long story short, it's better that this is happening now.
Yeah, definitely. At least get a plan in place. And, from what we've heard, it's no secret that the Bills are, leading the way in terms of coronavirus protocol and everything. So, I feel like they can come back from, something like this. There's obviously a lot of questions we have about, training camp in general, a lot of intense battles going on. So Kevin and I'll kind of just go back and forth asking you about, different people that we're interested in. And Kevin, I'll let you go first here.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, the hottest topic around Bills Nation everywhere is this receiver battle.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at it on paper, it's strong. They have their starting three. You can consider Andre Roberts a lock based on special teams comments and other comments that we've heard. But the depth behind that top three, how do you see it playing out, Matt? I mean, it's talked about across all day, every day. So we're trying to narrow it down. But more specifically, do you think Beane does one of his special compensation pick trades where he tries to get back a comp pick? Instead of playing the formula in free agency, he's going to trade one of these guys like he's alluded to many times. You think Robert Foster could fetch a 6th or 7th round pick? I think Duke Williams gets traded. What's your take on how that happens, especially with people saying, how good Gabe Davis has been, Isaiah Hodgins is there. I would think they have a leg up, but what's kind of your take on that as it pertains to maybe trading one of those guys for an asset?
In this uncertain season, I'm hesitant to say that anybody fits that mold, because I'm wondering if, you look at how they've structured camp, and I almost feel like they've been a little bit of a trend center, the Bills, in that how they've restricted the media from reporting at training camp as opposed to years past. You've seen other teams kind of adopt similar things after the fact. But I think the idea there is because it's a year without fans and because you can control more of the variables, it allows them to maybe hide some guys a little bit more. So you'll hear the usual stuff, Duke Williams making Duke Williams plays in practice. I mean, I'm telling you, man, every time you watch this guy in a practice field, you think he's Michael Irvin. I mean, he's just so unbelievably competitive at the catch point, physical, hard to cover, because even when guys are in position, I still feel like he out-battles them. If he could translate that to a game day situation, it's crazy to think about what he could potentially be. But here's the thing. I went into this thing saying that the four you just mentioned were locks. I had Gabe Davis as a lock before this all started. He is a mega super lock at this point. This guy is, at times, the best football player on the field. Today he made a nice play. Stephon Diggs was still Stephon Diggs.
Right.
And, I use that term loosely because whenever Stephon Diggs is on the field, he's the best receiver there. But most of the time. Gabe Davis is so far and ahead from where I think everybody thought he was going to be at this point. And Matt Barkley alluded to it in his press conference today. He was working with him out in California. He basically said that, by the time their workout stopped, he had a foundational, fundamental understanding of where he's supposed to line up on every formation in their playbook. That's a huge thing for a rookie, to go in with that comfort level at the start of things. So I think that Isaiah Hodgins has been good. He hasn't been as splashy as Gabe Davis, but he, to me, has kind of entered that lock conversation because he brings something that no one else does. Because what Duke Williams does well at the catch point, Isaiah Hodgins can do that as well. And plus, I think he's faster, quicker, a better athlete, more elusive in his route running. And that's a big deal. And that's what they want. And if he's going to line up in the slot, which, when they drafted him, that's what Brandon Beane said was a big reason why, a big body on the inside, he fits a role there. And then it becomes the question becomes, can they fit 7 guys on this roster? Do they want to fit 7 guys? Because in this environment, if one of those receivers goes down, that's a big role that you have to replace. And I think Isaiah Mckenzie, somebody that I feel so bad, I mentioned it on my podcast this afternoon. I haven't written about him yet, but I should be. He's playing so well. Like I haven't been able to fit him in as I'm covering the rookies and all these new players. But Isaiah Mckenzie looks as good as anybody else out there. He looks fast. He looks healthy. He looks stronger. And he made one play over the middle today where he was just so explosive and quick. And that's what they have. They have a bunch of guys that are explosive and quick. And that's a dangerous thing and a cool thing for Josh Allen as he tries to take the next step in year 3.
That sounds a lot like how you would describe the Chiefs receivers. It's just a bunch of explosive and quick guys who can kind of do it all. And if Duke Williams, he doesn't strike me as like a practice squad kind of guy because he's like, what is he, 29, 28? He's up there in age. So like, if he's on the outside looking in right now, what's his future look like to you?
I still think it depends. Like if there's a GM around the league is a fan, I could see a situation where he just turned 27, by the way, gotcha. In May. I think that, he could definitely be in play. I got to take a time out. There's my daughter. Hi, honey. What's the matter? You just wake up? All right, go see mom. She's upstairs. That's COVID-19 related. We're working in the house these days.
So I just woke up too. We're good.
But I think Duke could get signed if they cut him. But I think that that's a chance that you have to take. Now, if you could turn him into a 4th, 5th round pick, of course. But I think that they would rather try to stash him if they could, so they have an option of a guy that they know already played meaningful snaps for them last season. So, that's where I'm falling on.
Well, that's movement this year, then, you would say, because how can you, with all the testing and the ramp-ups and not being able to see preseason games, not having that pro personnel footage. So you would say that you would think you would have a better chance at keeping your 16 guys on the practice squad than you would in normal years. Is that right?
Yes, and we'll see where things stand when we get there. They're already kind of adjusting the rules and the protocol for how you can bring guys into your facility. It was very, very hard to do so at the beginning, and it's kind of getting easier as we go along. But even that process of, if you get to, a week before the season and all these players that do you have the manpower in your building to not only onboard somebody, but then to get them ready to play on your 53-man roster, that's going to be very interesting how teams navigate that around the league.
For sure.
And, one other thing that might kind of play into that is, like, just draft picks in general the next year, maybe next couple years, just because we're not going to have a real season to evaluate, are just going to be worth so much less. Like, you can make a point that, if there's anyone that can evaluate late-round talent, Bean and McDermott have done that relatively well. But, a fourth-round pick from, like, this coming draft in 2021 will probably be worth what, like, a seventh-round pick was last year. So, I understand hesitant to trade people for picks. And then kind of going off this whole receiver thing, because a lot of people are hesitant to want Andre Roberts on the roster. They don't want a dedicated, like, punt returner, kick returner. But Tywan Jones got hurt today, if I'm not mistaken. And so, I know we'll probably hear the injury news in the middle of recording here. I think that comes out at 4 p.m. But, what impact could Tywan Jones have on Andre Roberts? And what would your case kind of be to the person who doesn't want Andre Roberts on the roster?
Mm-hmm. So I think that they're not really – one doesn't impact the other. What Tywan Jones does doesn't really impact what Andre Roberts does because, he can return punts. I mean, he's not going to be a high-level kick returner. And that's something that from all parties involved, whether it be Heath Farwell or Sean McDermott, they want somebody that can influence the game from that spot, whether it be on kick returns or punt returns. Guys that, good elite kick returners, punt returners that can give you field possession, I mean, they come at a premium in this league. And they have that in Andre Roberts. He didn't break one last year, but Heath Farwell said he's gone back and looked at the tape. They've added guys that they think are going to help him maybe potentially break one. They still think that he's a feared weapon in this league. So I think that he's a lock just because they know that not only can they count on him to give them, at least decent starting field position, but he's going to hang on to the football. The argument for Isaiah Mckenzie there, I think, falls a little bit short because he struggled in that department when he's been given those opportunities. Tywan, if Tywan's hurt and out for a while, I think that opens up a potential spot for maybe a Robert Foster if you're in that camp where, he got a lot of gunner reps last year. And if that's, again, we can't report on what we're seeing in practice right now, who's getting those reps. And it's still, it's not like we're going to see in the regular season, but I think that it's a very, very uphill climb for Robert Foster to make this team, but that might give him a glimmer of hope, but we got to wait and see what this is.
Now, Farwell, when interviewed, said that he thinks they have the best gunner combo in the league. So you would think that Robert Foster in this case would be insurance to one of them getting hurt. Obviously we've seen one get hurt already. So I think that would be a way onto the roster for Foster at that point, not as much as a seventh receiver. He can obviously do that. But it would be purely as gunner one because just by nature of what Farwell has said in his own press conferences, saying he's got the best gunners in the league with Neal and Jones, and then going into basically being a natural fit, which is what they really spent all last year training him to be. So you would have to look at Foster as his way onto the roster being special teams. And I think he has the heads up over anyone else down there, right? As really being based on what we've seen last year as the main replacement in special teams.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see. Again, one of those things I can't really comment on because I can't really say what I've seen from from that perspective.
Right,
but, we're hamstrung here.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find a cool transition. There isn't one. Can't say.
Yeah. Well, we'll switch topics. I mean, we'll go to another interesting conversation point, and that's the running back room. And that's, I think, one of the most interesting things not talked about a lot. I mean, it is at the top with, how many carries Moss is getting and whatnot, or what he's doing and how people expect to see him in the lineup. But more importantly, what's going on? Are they going to keep 4 running backs? I mean, we haven't heard too much of Christian Wade at this point. I mean, they're only 5 in camp, which is low to me. Usually you have that Antonio Williams guy who's going to scrape up all those, 4th preseason game carries, maybe make practice squad. I mean, the weird caveat with Wade is if he's placed on the practice squad, he cannot be called up if he has that exemption spot. So do you see a path to the roster with the Jones injury for him? Do you see anything is Yeldon pretty locked in as the guy they trust? Like any movement? I mean, it just seems awfully low talked about beside obviously the starters. There's really, and that goes to say Bean today said that he expects Singletary to be his number 1 back, per se, starter per se, is I think how he put it. What's going on behind him to the best of your ability? Like, obviously, it looks pretty locked in, but does that mean there's nothing, even with that injury, no room to wait?
I'll just say this. I can't say anything about like Christian Wade in terms of where he's going, where he's playing. But you just look at it from, a 10,000-foot view. And just if you're the Bills and you have a team ready to compete, do you really think that you're not going to take advantage of a situation where you could protect a guy for another year on your practice squad who, even if he's ready for basic like responsibilities, is still you're taking a chance by rostering him. You're not going to get to see him in a live game in training camp in the preseason. There are none. So you'd kind of be flying blind. The last time we saw him play was a year ago, and I know that he was all the rage in training camp. And I love this dude, man. His story is so fun. Like, I want so much for him, and I don't root for the team anymore, but I root for a guy like Christian Wade because you see the work that he's putting in. You get a chance to be around him. You get to know about, who he is, and it's a great story. I just think that they brought in veterans. They have their two backs right now in Singletary and Moss, and I think bringing in a guy like Wade who, even going back to last season, I won't even talk about this year. He worked a lot on special teams last year. So I think he's working on that because he knows that that's probably going to be his path to a roster spot. So I guess never say never. I just think that for a guy that just started learning football 18 months ago, it's a big ask in a regime that literally hangs its hat on earning everything that you get. And I just don't know how he can earn it without games.
Yeah, I thought maybe one way onto the roster, like you mentioned, would be special teams and would be with that Jones injury potentially happening and or an injury to Yeldon, who I haven't seen talked about much, in general. I think he's just kind of that vet presence. He doesn't really have that competition. There's not another vet in camp really that he's competing with. Is there anything you can say on Yeldon that you've seen just in general?
Same old, same old. Every time he's on the field, he gives them what, I think that we've seen him give them over the last year since they signed him and what they talked about this offseason and what they like about him. He's a steady presence in the room. He's somebody that, shows up every day, goes where they want him to go, does what they want him to do. So I think that plays with them. And so I think that he's in the mix. I see him being potentially on the 53-man roster and then not being active on game days a lot like last year. But he'll be there. Listen, Singletary missed a few games last year. Zach Moss, has a history with injuries. I think that's a big reason why he fell into the third round in the draft, and some of these other guys went above him because from a talent perspective, it's easy to go back and watch his tape and then also watch him on the practice field now and kind of pair those two things together and really understand what the Bills like about him. He's a really good, like sometimes you watch rookie running backs and you see the, I don't want to say the hesitation, but just like they're not trusting their eyes yet. And just in this training camp setting, when they're going full speed, there's no issue there. I mean, there's a lot of trust in what he sees and what he's very deliberate. I think it was what Matt Barkley said today. He's a deliberate, downhill, powerful running back. And so I think that where do carries get split here? I still think that, like Brent B mentioned, they're going to go with Singletary. And I don't think that he did anything in those final 8 weeks last year to make you not think that they don't want him there. And I just think that Zach Moss can be that supplemental piece until you need him to be more. And that could come in week 1, week 4, week 10, not this season. It could come anytime, but they have two options, and it'll be interesting to see how they play that up because I think with Zach Moss maybe potentially be more efficient in the role that Frank Gore closed the season with last year. That can mean a lot for a better offense. And not only that, but you move the ball, you convert in the red zone. That could impact scoring too.
And another rookie kind of on a similar note, Reggie Gilliam. I've heard a lot of good things. I've heard that he's
Max Star, baby.
Heard he's had a lot of really good, good plays throughout training camp. But, obviously they like to have that veteran person in every room with Pat Marco. So, what future do you see for Gilliam? Because he sounds like a guy that if we had preseason games that a lot of people, he might be like, the Brandon Riley of the group.
I think Patrick DeMarco's got a real fight on his hands for this job because, I know they love his leadership, but there's so much leadership in that locker room now. I mean, you look on both sides of the ball, and we're talking about young leadership now that'll be able to take the baton from guys that have left the building. I mean, you look on the defensive side as an example, and Lorenzo Alexander leaves, and it's already, you could tell without a doubt, Harrison Phillips has assumed a portion of that leadership role. A guy in just his third season. I mean, he's in practice at the beginning of training camp. He said they were OTA style practices, but they're happening in July because of the COVID situation. And he's like, guys, we're having mental errors here, and it's understandable because it feels like OTAs, but it's not. We got to get it. We got a game in a month and a half or a month or whatever it was. And so you see that kind of playing out in some of these guys. So I think DeMarco, that becomes less important as your locker room grows and you build, the kind of roster that Brandon's built and Sean's built. So I think Gilliam's really talented. I think that for a quarterback who likes to throw downfield to a fullback, it might be a little bit better to have a guy like Gilliam on the other end of it. But he's just a physical presence. I think he's really popped as a blocker this week. And so, no pun intended. But I think that, it's a good battle. We'll see how it goes. I'm still very interested to see which way they go because, again, without the preseason games, you really can't. You could get the feel in a scrimmage-like environment, but I just still don't think it's the same.
Yeah, bummer we didn't get 4 preseason games. I never thought that was possible. Even one would have been so big for this team.
I never thought I would miss them like this because of the roster that we have to cover here. Because there's so many intriguing battles, and in this environment, we can't really talk about what we're seeing.
Exactly.
If we all got the preseason games, we kind of could have had that collective conversation. So it's tough.
Yeah, and it's not just to see Josh Allen; it would be to see the guys we're talking about here, and that's what we're lacking. And I know I've watched Gilliam in MAC play; I've been covered him while covering UB, and he's just a special teams wizard. Blocked kicks, runs fullback flies. One of Josh Allen's favorite plays. They called on Patrick DeMarco last year, so it's interesting. He is their exact fullback that they might hand make. So we'll have to watch that as the preseason continues to go on. But linebackers is a huge room to me because you have Matt Milano and you have a lot of things going on there. He needs a contract at some point. And when's he going to get it? I think so. But you go down, what's behind them though? If we have an injury there, you have a couple of names, Roshan Joseph. Is there any guys that, in your opinion, Matt, are standing out that will make the roster? I've just seen nothing at that group. Obviously the starters are pretty transparent, but just behind them in general, is there plays that you've seen being made? Is there guys that look like they can fill in if one of those guys gets hurt or goes on the COVID list? Anything you've seen behind that linebacker group? So
if you're familiar with training camp practices and when they have the shells on, it's really hard to evaluate the linebacker position because when they're not live hitting, even today, it was a thud up practice. They had pads on, but it was very the physicality wasn't really there. So we could see the quickness but one guy I will mention, and he's somebody that I kept off my first initial 53-man roster projection, who if I did it again today, I would put him on now, and that's Tyrell Dodson.
Okay.
I love his versatility. I remember a conversation I had with Julian Stanford at the red and white scrimmage game last year. They were all coming off the field, and I just wanted to grab him about Dodson because he popped to me that night, and I said, what's going on with this kid? Because nobody's talking about him, and it seems like he's all over the place. And he's like, that's just the thing. He's all over the place. I've never seen a rookie come in and learn all 3 linebacker positions as completely as it seems like Tyrell Dodson has. So then you start to kind of throw it through your brain a little bit, and you know how much they love position flexibility. And in a year where you could be without a Tremaine Edmonds to an injury or a COVID or a Matt Milano to an injury who's been missed chunks of time before, to have a guy that can kind of do a little bit of everything, and in a guy like Dodson who it's going to come down to special teams too, like who's contributing the most on special teams, who's popping for Farwell. And that's something that even privy to the practices, you never know how those really, those competitions play out, because Farwell could be looking for something completely different on his unit than you or I would as a fan or a media member, whoever, but just like the untrained eye, if you will. So I'll be interested to see how that goes. I don't think Ryan Talbot, who's my guy, we covered the team together, he made a great point on the show today. He's like, I just don't think that we're at a stage where Vashon Joseph would be that important to keep, or that they'd be that worried about losing if you thought that Tyrell Dodson or Corey Thompson would give you that much more of a bang for your buck as that depth option in that backup role.
And they've loved Thompson for a long time.
Right. And he's played meaningful snaps for them already. They got there.
Yeah.
Keeping with the defense, obviously someone who, under a normal year may have been traded possibly as Trent Murphy. But given the shortened no preseason, shortened training camp and everything, we can't exactly expect Epinesa to step into a top 3 role in the defensive end rotation. What does he look like, and how do you see his future going here? Because basically the question is buy, cut, or trade for Trent Murphy.
So this is a really nuanced discussion because I feel like depending on what day of the week I wake up, I have a different thought process on Trent Murphy. And because it's such a weird year, I think if this was entering last year, he would have been a lock, even with this roster, because we didn't have the COVID influencing the salary cap. The financial concerns weren't that the cap was still really advantageous for what they were doing and where they were at. But now, cutting Trent Murphy now could be the difference in being able to re-sign Matt Milano. And so if you're in that position, to me, it's a no-brainer but here's what it comes down to too. I think there should be a day in training camp over the next couple weeks where you earmark that date and you say, we're going to sit down as a group, front office and coaching staff, and say, can we cut Daryl Johnson? If that answer to that is no, then that means Trent Murphy's gone. Because if you're not willing to lose Daryl Johnson, then I don't see how you could keep Trent Murphy. Finances, be damned. I just don't think they're going to really be able to keep 9 defensive linemen. Maybe they can, and maybe they're willing to do that with Trent Murphy. I just don't see it. So I think from that perspective, you move on from him and you say, first of all, I think A.J. Epinesa, for all intents and purposes, I know they took him in the second round. He's a first-round pick. I mean, this is a guy that, I think most people had as second or third best defensive end in this draft. So those expectations shouldn't be, couched at all. I think he should still be expected to be a part of the rotation. He got guys like Mario Addison, Quentin Jefferson, and of course Jerry Hughes to lead the way that can give you good, solid reps and snaps, a lot of them on the outside. But you have Daryl Johnson to supplement, and then I think you need A.J. Epinesa to assume a role that a first-round draft pick would assume. And I think all indications from camp is he's ready to do that. He's ready to kind of – and it's so cool because of the talent they have around him, I think he's going to pop more than anybody's even expecting because he just fits what they want him to do, and he's so versatile that it's going to be tough for offensive coordinators to kind of track where he is. He's the most athletic, I think, of all of them because he's so big, which is then so crazy because of how bad he was at the combine. But I just think his straight line speed, I was talking to Joe Biscaglia today, and I was saying, I think the problem with him is he's so big and brawny.
Yep.
It's almost impossible for him to run a fast 40. And so I think the Bills, a lot like Gabe Davis, where if you remember the embedded series when Brandon was like, I hope he runs this number. Mm-hmm. I think that the Bills were thrilled that he stunk at the combine because everything on the practice field, he looks like the real deal.
Yeah, he does. And he plays all the position versatilities we've used with a couple of players today. And he said it himself. He's played every single position on that line. He's going to get a lot of time, especially if these injuries / COVID situations like we saw today happen. You're going to see Epinesa cross the line. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch and see how many that D-line discussion's huge, how many they're willing to keep. And I keep hearing about Brian Cox Jr.
Yeah, he's balling too.
So what do they do there? I don't know. There's some hard decisions to be made. Maybe that's a position group they will get a pick from somewhere along that if they had to make a move. So we'll have to follow that one as closely as receiver. And kind of lastly, is offensive line. I know it's a tough one to talk about because who's getting first, who's getting seconds and thirds. We can't obviously dive into that as much, but all I can say is I saw Winters get bullied by Epinesa, and that was the first time in my head that I said, is he a lock to be the right guard spot? I don't know. What do you see, Matt, in your opinion, not based on rep counts, in your opinion, is Winters that lock at right tackle? Do we see more Darrell Williams than we think? What?
No.
What's the way that works out?
He is not a lock. And I also think that there's – the cool thing about what they're doing here is I don't think they need to arrive on a decision because they're so willing to take 10 into the regular season. And the new rule it's almost benefits teams to be over, I think is it 8 offensive linemen or 7? If you're over that number, then you can bring 2 position players back, or skill position players onto the roster. If you don't have those linemen, one of those guys of the 55 has to be a lineman. So, but I think that Darrell Williams is in the mix. I think they're all in the mix all over the place, and that's about as far as I can go with what I've seen. But I think that just hearing the fact that, to me, that they're still unwilling to commit to Cody Ford at tackle, just tells me that they don't know. And we're going to get to the season, and whatever the best combination that they've seen is what they're going to go with until it's not working, and they're going to change up on the fly. One guy who I think is still going to play a role or a factor, and I don't know where it's going to be, but maybe a potential another timeshare is Heinzeki. Yeah. I was talking to somebody at the Combine. I told this to somebody recently. I always say this. I hate saying the same thing on 2 podcasts, but it's an important line. So I feel like it's worth hearing. He is a former offensive lineman in the NFL, and we were just having a drink talking about the Bills last year, and he spent a lot of time breaking down the Bills' offensive line. He was doing it for his employer, and he told me one of the things that he saw was that probably 60% of the time, 70% of the time that he was on the field, Heinzeki was the Bills' best offensive lineman last year. And that's crazy to think about because he doesn't play a lot. He's older. He's 35 now, and you got the injury concerns, but you want that talent on the field if you're Brandon Beane for your third-year quarterback and Josh Allen. So I still think he's going to figure into the mix. I still think that, what happens if Deion Dawkins goes down with an injury or has COVID, and Heinzeki's best reps or snaps in Washington were at left tackle. So I'm very interested to see how this ends up playing out. They have a lot of interesting options. The Spencer Long thing to me is still crazy. I almost feel like Brandon Beane has a sixth sense about some of these things.
He does.
Yeah,
he does.
Because he barely lasted in San Francisco before he retired. So if you don't have buy-in here, if you're not ready to scratch, claw, and kill, they're not going to keep you on the roster. They've proven that. So I think Winters has to prove that. I think he's hungry, but I question where he's at coming off that shoulder injury. He said he's been good about 4 or 5 months, but once you get in, as Brian Dable always likes to say, the live bullets start flying, it's a whole different game.
Yeah, definitely is. And like many people during these times right now, we are as a victim to the unpaid subscription to Zoom time clock. So we only got about 5 minutes or so left. So, we were going to pick the Bills. We'll save that for another time. Maybe we can have you on before the season starts one more time so we can do that. Maybe just round this out with you giving 2 players, one, your biggest riser during training camp, and one player whose stock has really fallen over the last week.
Wow. That's a great question. You should probably write a story on that.
I'm assuming that's in the works.
So my biggest riser would have to be Zach Moss, just because we went into this thing pretty much thinking this was going to be at some point this season, like some version of a timeshare. I mean, I was even open to 50-50 by Thanksgiving. Like, you know what I mean? I thought that could happen. Now, I think Devin Singletary is a starter, but this guy is going to get a workload. There's no doubt in my mind. And they complement each other so well. They both do so many things well. They both have a lot of flexibility in what they're able to do when they're in the field. And the key for me, and this is what really makes me buy in, is, and I'm actually working on a story on this for tomorrow, is Sean McDermott said that he's been very good, quote unquote, in his pass protection. That's huge for a rookie running back.
Oh, yeah, true.
So if they have confidence in him there's not a situation in a game where they're going to feel nervous about sending him out there. So I think he's the biggest riser right now. But ask me again in a week, and it could be somebody else.
Yeah, and then the last one.
Who's dipping? Who is dipping? That is a great question. I hate to use this because of an injury, but I will say that because there's nobody that's really popped as somebody that's, No, I'll go with Jake Fromm.
Really?
Who
that's interesting.
I think that it's twofold. Number one, he hasn't done a lot of things wrong. It's just the lack of things that he's done right to me so far. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately for him, he's in a situation where he doesn't have a lot of time to make an impression. So there was one moment in 11 on 11 on Thursday where he popped for a minute. He made two nice completions. It was the Duke Williams one, and one was the Gabe Davis, I think. And Gabe Davis, you could probably put him as the riser too. I mean,
I thought you were going to say him. I really did.
I just think because I still had expectations for Davis going
That's
in,
true.
where I didn't really know what my expectations were for Moss, and he's just completely blown them away. But I just think for Fromm, it was such a tough ask for him to make or to become that backup, and I'm still very hesitant to believe they'll go with three quarterbacks because I think that they've shown the ability in years past. And they brought in Matt Barkley off the street and threw him out as a starter, and he beat the Jets on the road. And so I think that they believe in their coaching staff to be able to, like, whereas most teams around the league might be worried about something like that. If somebody signed Jake Fromm, and here's another thing, I also think there's going to be a situation where, I don't know about Jake, but for Davis Webb, who's really comfortable in Buffalo, is really close with Josh Allen, is really integrated well, and I think that Sean McDermott said, he's going to be a coach in this league after he's done. He's really bright. He might want to stay here and continue to kind of develop himself as a coach in this environment, as he moves through. So you might be able to stash him on your practice squad as the backup to Barkley. And so I just think that Jake Fromm, it's not so much for what he's done wrong, it's just what he hasn't done right.
And they wouldn't be worried about losing him.
Yeah, no, definitely not. I hate to cut this short here, guys, but, like I said, we're on a little bit of a time crunch here. Don't want to get cut off in the middle. So, Perrino, thank you so much for joining. I know it was a little bit of a hassle to not nail down a time, but I really look forward to it again.
Love Picasso's Pizza.
Yes,
Love
sir.
Yummy Thai. The best Thai food in Western New York.
Shout out
there.
to YT. Shout out to YT. Best
My
Thai
man,
food
Kevin
around.
put me onto that. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Yep, thank you, man. Appreciate it. And make sure you guys check out the giveaway we're running on Twitter right now. We're giving away a signed Zach Moss jersey. That is Matt Perrino's biggest riser for training camp. So you're definitely going to want that jersey. For me, Kevin, Matt Perrino, and all of Trainwreck Sports, we'll see you next time.